Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Wayne Ranney, and I serve on the board of the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And I want to welcome you to our virtual outing for November. Tonight, we're very pleased to have Cindy Stafford, who is a Historical Society member and a former ranger at the Glen Canyon National Recreation area. And tonight we'll hear from Cindy about how the start of Page, Arizona came about.
As we do with every one of our virtual outings, we start out with our mission statement. Grand Canyon Historical Society celebrates and promotes the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon's region, the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. We've extended that to include this other sentence. The Grand Canyon Historical Society is the official Park Service partner with Grand Canyon for interpretation and educational services. We also would like you to become a member. Our dues are only $35 per year. We're an all-volunteer organization. So please join us so we can continue to expand all of our activities, such as these monthly virtual outings. Very easy to join, or if you prefer just to donate, you just go to our website, grandcanyonhistory.org, and right at the top, you click on join or donate, and you'll walk you through the very easy e-commerce steps. But tonight we are pleased to welcome back Cindy Stafford. Cindy has worked as a seasonal ranger for Glen Canyon National Recreation Area and now volunteers in the museum collection and visitor services. She and her husband, Kern Nuttall, enjoy exploring their surrounding landscape and digging through historic archives. They live in Page, Arizona. And tonight's talk will actually be beginnings 1956 to 1975, from government camp to becoming the city of Page, Arizona.
Okay, thank you. Many of you will recognize Page, Arizona for this world-class scenery that we have, like Horseshoe Bend or the Navajo Tribal Park of Antelope Canyon. But that wasn't always the case. The United States Bureau of Reclamation built the town of Page, Arizona as a work camp for the construction of Glen Canyon Dam. And they managed the town for about 17 years before turning over the keys to the city March 1st, 1975. And Page became its own functioning, or maybe not so functioning, municipality, the youngest town in Arizona. Page has been a city for 50 years this year, and they're celebrating all year long. This marks an opportunity for us to explore our beginnings and the controversies that are still being played out today. The Glen Canyon story includes the battle for Echo Park and Dinosaur National Monument, that's upstream on the Green River. The Echo Park Dam was part of the Upper Colorado River Storage Project, but it caught the attention of folks who did not want national monuments and national parks to be altered. The Sierra Club's 1955 book, This is Dinosaur, was edited by Wallace Stegner, and it reminded politicians and the public of what would be lost. The lawmakers reluctantly removed Echo Park Dam from the project in favor of Glen Canyon Dam, where the land did not enjoy federal protection. The flooding of Glen Canyon remained a painful reminder of what it was lost in the bargain. And this was the very first time that the Goliath of the Bureau of Reclamation had been thwarted. The earlier 1913 flooding of Yosemite Valley by Hetch Hetchy Dam was a precedent that conservationists did not want repeated. The flooding occurred in 1913. Conservationists vowed that no other national preserve would have the same fate. And they consented to a higher Glen Canyon Dam if Rainbow Bridge National Monument would be protected. The Sierra Club published another coffee table book called The Place No One Knew as a eulogy once the beauty of Glen Canyon was recognized. And plenty of Boy Scouts and people like Katie Lee and her friends did admire and celebrate Glen Canyon and its beauty. but not enough politicians knew about it. Just an overview map so we can become familiar with the area if you're not. In the upper right, that's Dinosaur National Monument on the border of Colorado and Utah, Green River. Then the confluence of Canyonlands National Park was eyed once upon a time as a dam site, but the national park status protected it. Rainbow Bridge National Monument is 50 miles upstream on Lake Powell from Page, Arizona, which is where the star is on the map, just south of the Utah border. It takes about 2.5 hours by boat to get there, and probably at the lake level this year, it would be a 1.5 mile hike each way. Downstream in Marble Canyon, there was a dam proposed for Marble Canyon, where the dot is, and then below the Grand Canyon, there was another dam called Bridge Canyon Dam proposed. Rainbow Bridge National Monument became a national monument in 1910. It's one of the very early ones. It's very small. It's only 160 acres, 1 square mile. And the lake or the reservoir, the pending reservoir, would encroach upon it. But built into the legislation for the Colorado River Storage Project, it said no dam or reservoir shall be within any national park or monument. So plans were made to perhaps build barrier dams downstream and upstream in an effort to protect it. But the infrastructure that would be required to build those dams made no sense if they would do more damage than the fluctuating levels of the reservoir. And the reservoir would not always encroach on the national monument. So the barrier dams were included in the Interior's budget each year, but Congress never funded them. And the plans to make Rainbow Bridge a national park did not work out at all. Historian Greg Crampton says, people have been looking into this country for a long time. They love it, they curse it, they gut it, they change it, and they endure it. And not all have found it beautiful. Historian P.T. Riley says, this is country where God loses his boots. An early bureau photo, and I just got an internet connection is unstable. Don't like that. Let me know. Rod Sanderson is shown in this early Bureau of Reclamation photo. There was access from Wahweap Creek to King Creek as early as 1953. And King Creek is the location for the landing when the river was closed due to the construction of the dam. People who wanted to come down the river would have to exit at the King Creek landing. And if you wanted to go on to the Colorado River, you would have to take this approach to King Creek. And it was 25 miles upstream from the dam site. On the right is Katie Lee and the sign warning people that you must exit the river at this location. Stuart Udall was our Secretary of Interior. He was he was an Arizona congressman before that. And he was trying to figure out which side of the canyon the town side of Page should go on. Would it go on the Utah side or would it go on the Navajo Nation side? And in this legislation on the right, the article says more than $9 million had been approved that year for Glen Canyon Dam, and it was part of the $13 million allocated for the Upper Colorado River Storage Project. The funding also included money for Flaming Gorge Dam on the Green River and Navajo Dam on the San Juan River. The early Bureau Preliminary Geologic Report talked about the sparse habitation of this area, very difficult travel. There really weren't too many roads at all. Scarce water resources, very scant vegetation. There was a lot of sand and rocks. Basically a vast expanse of wasteland. The good news, gravel was available in Wahweap Creek. An earlier cowboy description from the 20s said it's a lot of rocks, a lot of sand, more rocks, more sand, and wind to blow it away. The area where Page became located was called Manson Mesa. It's named from Manson Yazzie. He was a sheep herder, and the Yazzie families would use the mesa for seasonal purposes, grazing sheep, depending on the resources and time of year. Trader John Wetherill from Oljeto and Kayenta said, "The desert will take care of you. At first it's all big and beautiful, but you're afraid of it. And then you begin to see its dangers and you hate it. Then you learn how to overcome its dangers and the desert is home." The Bureau sent its public information officer, Bud Ruscio, out to talk to some local families. He's in the white hard hat. And the Synagines are in the copper mine area. That's more than 20 miles south of where Page became located. And some of their descendants, many of them are still in the area. On the right is George Charlie. He's posing in his Navajo garb and on his horse for a Bureau photograph at the dam site. And he worked for the Bureau. He was a high scaler. Another early pioneer, Art Green, was taking people from Lee's Ferry all the way up to Rainbow Bridge on this boat with an airplane engine on it. And they would stay overnight. They would hike the 12 miles round trip to Rainbow Bridge, and then he'd bring them back down. I think there were about 150 people a year that he took. And eventually he and his family were the first concessioners for the Wahweap Marina area. And this is one of their early brochures. From 1 day to 5 days, all of their trips included Rainbow Bridge. And at the bottom, he talks about 3 roads to the rainbow. The first is a spectacular flight from Page, or it says actually from Wahweap over Lake Powell. And then the second way is an exciting horseback trip through the Navajo Nation, 16 miles to Rainbow Bridge. And then the third way is by boat. 6 months after the authorization, President Eisenhower pushed the button to trigger explosions at the dam site. He said, "I'm told that when I press this button, there are going to be 500 tons of earth go in the air and rock, and I assume that you are all safely protected from any effects of that." Kaboom, it all starts here. Where to put the town site is still one of the initial problems, and 53,000 acres were going to be traded with the Navajo Nation. In this article, Eisenhower is quoted as saying, "By providing flood control, hydroelectric power, and water for irrigation and other uses, will transform an undeveloped area." He did not mention the number one reason for this reservoir and dam. It was to store water for the upper basin states and not release or let all the water run downstream to evil places like California and Arizona. So the land that the Navajo Nation received in exchange for about 17 square miles for the town site of Page was in the upper right. It's 1958, if you can see that, in southeastern Utah. And that land contained oil and gas resources. On the right, the article talks about the more than $4 million that is released in a contract for Kiewit Judson Pacific Murphy to build the Glen Canyon Bridge. Building a town from the ground up was not an easy task. When we brainstormed this at the Page Library, people came up with ideas for what we would need. And of course, you could think of roads and houses and food, water, sewage, electricity, hospitals, schools, churches, recreation, jobs, and many more things, which we'll see. Glen Canyon, Utah is Big Water, Utah today. It's 14 miles from our dam site in Utah. This ad that appeared in the Salt Lake Tribune was advertising for all sorts of storekeepers and shopkeepers. They wanted a modern shopping center. They said clothing and hardware, barbershop, variety store. As far as I know, the only thing that was in Glen Canyon, Utah was a brothel. Water was hauled in from the copper mine chapter. There was a well there, and diesel generators provided the early electricity or the early power. There was a warehouse and a mess hall, and then just lots of trailers. The early project would be delivery of water from downstream of the dam. And the silty water was always a challenge to get up to the out of your faucet. People would put socks over their faucet to try to filter out the silt. An early newspaper from 1959 talked about how if the water level in the river dropped, that the pumps would be very inefficient. But they wanted to reassure people and said, we're not going to run out of water in Page. But then in the very same article on the right, it said that a huge sandbar was plaguing the water supply. Women complained, of course, about not being able to get their wash clean. And blowing sand was also an issue, not just the water out of the tap. It was called Page Gold. And if anyone sneezed on the west side of town, they said you'd have an acre of sand on the east side. Iona Pinkerton wrote this poem that got published in the paper. She said, last weekend, me and my pard worked on the patio, worked in the yard, transplanted rocks, buried flat stones, collected sunburn and aching bones, planted seedlings, a true spring green. A landscaped yard soon will be seen. Now comes the wind, comes the sand, covers patio, garden, and land. Woe is me, woe is him. This weekend, we start again. Sometimes I think we still have the same problems. This trailer town on the tableland had a rather grim Christmas in 1957. Someone got a Christmas tree and put some lights on it. And on the upper right, the transit homes were maybe one step up from the pull-behind trailers. I think they came in on flatbed trucks and provided a little better housing option. Post office is really an important thing for a town. Lem Wiley is the project manager on the dam. He's on the left. And Mildred Page is cutting the ribbon to open the post office. This was on the anniversary of her husband's death. His birthday, his 70th birthday. He had died a couple years before. And stamps at the time were just 3 cents. In a few years, by 1961, this was a town in a kind of controlled chaos. You never could find a place to park within 3 blocks of the post office, and you couldn't rent a box at any price. You simply stood in line at the general delivery window like everyone else, in just the same way as you queued up at the bank and the spanking new Babbitt's store, a true supermarket at last. The water supply wasn't much improved, but the school, the finest facility in Coconino County, everyone said, was a growing concern now, serving 1,500 students. The students walked through basically construction zones on their way to school, and there would be blasts of dynamite as excavations through the sandstone was taking place. In the center is a drawing that the artist and daughter of John Page, Jean, drew of the first Butler building that was a school. The school started with 5 teachers and 88 students, and by the end of the year, there were 12 and I think 155 students. And there were constant fluctuations and large fluctuations depending on the contractors working at the dam. So the school and the town had to deal with these huge differences in population. There were sadly 18 men that were killed in the building of the dam, and the students and teachers would freeze when they heard the sirens going off at the dam site, not knowing whose dad might not be coming home that night or whose loved one. And there were many injuries, but the safety record was much improved from the building of Hoover Dam 30 years before. The hospital was an important feature in October of 1957, and Dr. Ivan Kazan was one of the founding members of the town of Page. He was involved in a lot of community efforts. Here in 1958, he's giving the first polio shot in Page. Lem Wiley was the project engineer, said he could get streets and sewers built in a hurry, but as de facto mayor, police chief, housing and welfare administrator, and recreation director, well, that's not nearly as simple as raising a 10 million ton dam. And you'll notice Mildred Page is there with the photograph of her husband behind her. This is the dedication of the dam. the project starting. And just a couple pictures of the early streets in Page. On the left are the Bureau homes. Those were the more permanent homes. There's still some of the nicer homes in Page. A lot have been upgraded and redone. On the right is the main road, Highway 89, into Page. Before it was paved, it would be quite a mucky mess when it rained. And the sign over there warns solicitors, you must have a permit before canvassing the residents of Page. See the ranger on duty. The bank building at first was just a trailer, and the men's store on the right says, we're closing out, we quit. The beauty and wild beauty of these untamed canyons is not for everyone, Neil Judd reminds us. The Babbitt Brothers Trading Store was located a block away from our main street now, Lake Powell Boulevard, behind the Styx Market. And in the center is Donna Taylor talking to P.D. Lloyd Dietz. In the center left is the Merritt, Chapman, and Scott Trailer Park, and they were the contractors for the dam. A quart of milk was 19 cents, and popsicles were 5 cents. You can see that the grocery store at the beginning was really more like a warehouse in the contractor's camp. And then in a couple of years, there were a few grocery stores, and this one is looking like a real supermarket. The prefab wash houses were part of the Transa homes, and there was only one laundromat in town. There were 4 washing machines, wringer washers, and 1 telephone. So people had to stand in line wherever they went. And of course, beauty shops, that was one of the early things in 1957, as well as a barber shop. Getting from one side of the 700-foot canyon to the other was a real challenge. It was 196 miles from one side to the other. So building roads, both from the Marble Canyon area to Page and from Kanab to the east, was really critical. The first crossing of the canyon was a footbridge, and people talked about how scary that was. You could look right down 700 feet to the river. It was a shudderingly unobstructed view. It would shake and sway when people were walking across it, and it's a quarter of a mile long. On the right is one of the early Bureau Rangers. The side rails were kind of a chicken wire thing, and just not a very stable feeling conveyance. On the left is the Big Cut. That's the road that was brought up from the Marble Canyon area through the Echo Cliffs. And on the right are some more Transa homes. I think that's North Navajo Drive with Lachee Rock in the background. The center of Page photo from 1958. These 2 photos might bring you some smiles because it doesn't look like there's much of a center at all. But lots and lots of trailers. And if the lingering strife between you and your neighbor with a bad attitude and barking dog got out of hand, both parties would get one warning, and the next time your trailers would be hauled to the edge of town. So there wasn't a lot of misbehavior because everybody needed their jobs. Within a year, there was an acute teacher housing shortage. This looks like it could be a headline from today. Some of the work at the dam went on for 24 hours a day, and here you see the lights when there was the building of the bridge, the Keyway excavation in 1958. The monkey slide on the left was metal cages that got workers to the bottom of the dam. And it says that the first monkey slide had a single brakeman on the rim who had to watch for a mark on the cable to know when to keep the cage and its occupants from auguring into the riverbank below. I'm not sure I would be willing to get in one of those cages. And on the right, there was a footbridge at the bottom of the work site as well to get workers from one side to the other. The workers on the bridge don't look like they have a whole lot of safety gear on, maybe the hard hats. And then on the right is the left diversion tunnel. That's where they're going to plan to build coffer dams on either side of the work site and divert the Colorado River through this tunnel so that they can build the dam. Some more photos of the footbridge and then Glen Canyon Bridge being built. And then on the right, the photograph that was so award-winning as a bridge. It was the highest bridge in the world at the time, I believe, and it was the second longest at 1/4 of a mile long. It won engineering awards. The Merritt, Chapman, and Scott workers are going to be losing their free meals and lodging. The bridge dedication was set for February 20th, and they were hoping to divert the river February 1st, and that would be at the lowest flow before the spring snow melt started. Well, there was a walkout that held up work on the dam site. The workers were dissatisfied with not getting their remote area status pay, but Merritt, Chapman, and Scott said the facilities in Page are equal to, and in some cases superior to, those in some non-remote areas. They were worried that maybe the strike would delay the dedication of the dam, but a week later they said, no, this is going to go on whether or not they're still on walkout. And of kind of a humorous note, it says the 500 workers on strike like to meet at Waterhole Canyon. It was their favorite meeting spot. The bridge transformed the face of the desolate Arizona-Utah frontier with eventual benefit for millions of vacationing Americans. 7,500 people attended the bridge dedication. You can see on the right that the road going up to the bridge is still unpaved. Every member of both state legislatures attended the ceremony, and both states' governors, a lot of bigwigs from the Bureau, Navajo Nation Chairman Paul Jones, the Navajo Tribal Band, and 30 newspaper reporters. It was big national news. You can imagine how important the bridge was to transport equipment and buildings and people from one side to the other. At this point in time, there were 5,000 residents. We'll see that number fluctuates a great deal. And the workers earned from $2 to $3 and change an hour, and the high scalers were also one of the higher paid. These photos are from Mike's Dam Photo Journal website. It's a great website if you like the Page history. He has videos and collects a lot of memorabilia from the early days. He graduated from Page High School, and his dad was one of the early people in the area. We know that this photo would be after 1959-ish because the bridge is intact there. Of course, recreation is an important thing, and cooling off in these hot summers, so a swimming hole was built on the west side. And then within a year, Merritt, Chapman, and Scott had paid $40,000 for a pool in the center of Page. The kids are having a watermelon eating contest on the left, and the teenagers are having a dance. They showed movies outdoors. Those movies came from the Bureau in Denver, and you'd maybe get 1 or 2 a week, and they'd show them over and over. If all else failed, you could watch your dad or your neighbor's dad. There was always a project going on. And a 9-hole golf course went in fairly early. It was called one of the finest links in America. The volunteers watered round the clock in 2-hour shifts to get the grass growing. And it was very much appreciated. On the right, the clubhouse is now a restaurant called Sunset 89. You could hold barbecues without having sand blowing all over. You could relax on your chaise lounges, and you could ride your horse down there, and you had these beautiful views of the canyon and the bridge and the dam site. And of course, once the dam regulated flows, then you have the recreation involved in rafting, both the flat water between Lee's Ferry and the dam, and then families like the Diamonds and the Sandersons starting downriver trips from Lee's Ferry through the Grand Canyon. There was another strike with the workers at the school walking out. They said, we have substandard working conditions. We want our subsistence payments. A week later, they were saying, they're going to be back on the job. And I think that headline is saying 500,000 visitors were forecast, but they thought it might take several years, maybe even decades to get there. Well, the strike at the dam was a big deal. And in July of 1959, it lasted for 6 months. The population at this point was 3,500, but it was still the 10th largest city in Arizona, and it immediately plummeted to less than 800 as workers just hauled their trailers out of town to the next job site. So places like the pharmacy and the grocery store that still remained had to extend a lot of credit for the families that remained. Merritt Chapman and Scott said, we spent $2.5 million on housing. We've built city recreation and health facilities. What are you guys complaining about? The school strike entered its second week. In the same paper, a local resident said, hey, we want grass and a park in the town of Page, not just at the country club where you have to pay dues. And you can notice the weather in July is cooler at the city than it is on the rim. And of course, in the bottom of the canyon, it's going to be about 10 degrees warmer than the town site. The editor of the Page Signal, an early newspaper, had some ideas for settling the strike. He said that the negotiators should hold the talks outside in Page in July, that they should live in the trailer or the barracks like the workers did, and that their evening entertainment should be those once-a-week movies or the ping pong or hikes. He did propose that they'd get their weekends off. On the right, they're worried about the school strike, and they're saying if it's going on much longer, we might have to use the Bureau's warehouse, which the high school used the year before. Well, both strikes eventually ended, and this one that was 6 months long was cause for great celebration at New Year's, the end of 1959. By 1960, the footprint of the town of Page looks pretty much like it does today. The roads are paved and the looping roads around the town are similar today. Some new signage on the right, they're touting what the services are for visitation. The Park Service is planning their recreation area. These photos of the gentlemen are so poor. This is Floyd Dominy, who's on the left in the newspaper article, Commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation for most of this project. Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall says that they are trying to solve the problem to save Rainbow Bridge from possible eventual destruction. The Park Service said that Glen Canyon National Recreation Area would be second in popularity only to Yellowstone, and that the new Park Service headquarters would be at the former West Side Rec Club. I don't think that's still in existence. That the Park Service would do photo and ground mapping, and they planned 8 sites for development. Wauweep, Lee's Ferry, Bullfrog, and Height were the only 4 that became developed, and Height hasn't been usable for many years. It's at the north end of the lake. Floyd Dominy is standing next to a depiction of where he wants to put the Marble Canyon Dam downstream. One visitor center that didn't get built is on River Right below the dam. It was going to connect by tram to the upper left and take fishermen and their boats and visitors down into the canyon. But now you have to drive all the way to Lee's Ferry, 50 miles. We have a unique feature in Page. This curve of Lake Powell Boulevard is filled with churches, many, many churches, and it's called Church Row. But living in this isolated area contributed to everyone helping everyone else. People volunteered to help other people build their churches. They helped with the golf course, swimming pool, homes, parks, and playgrounds. It was just a way of community life, and we had to create our own entertainment here. And they had a lot of fun, and they forged lifelong friendships. I've read, though, that some of the early wives, when they were brought here by their husbands, spent the first week crying. The first bucket of concrete was celebrated. P.D. Lloyd Dietz is on the left, posing for a bureau photo. And on the right is the concrete mixing plant that was built on the edge of the canyon. There was also an ice factory, if you want to call it ice making, to cool the concrete as it cured. 3,500 people came for this event. It said it's the beginning of a 2.5-year project, and it had already taken 2.5 years to get to this point. The press tour was going on the footbridge. They were touring the concrete plant, the city of Page, and they were going to visit the floor of the canyon. This coincided with the second annual Navajo ceremonial, so it was a big weekend. This photo depicts the coffer dams upstream and downstream to allow for the building of the dam. And the diversion tunnel, you can't quite see, it's on River Right. This photo shows Manson Mesa in the center left, and whoops, the star would be the Hanging Garden area. That's a nice hike, and when you do that hike, you can see the concrete slabs where these barracks are and some of the debris still from the dam, and it's sort of a living museum. The Hanging Garden area is a depiction of our hanging gardens, and that's why Glen Canyon got its name. So we have native orchids and maidenhair fern in that hanging garden, and it's easily accessible. We don't get a lot of snow, but there is some. I've heard back 30 years ago, there was a 3-foot snowstorm in northern Arizona, but we only get a dusting and it usually melts off pretty quickly. Hollywood came to Page. 2 episodes of the popular series Route 66 were filmed here. I think you can still watch those. Every cause for celebration, 1 million barrels of concrete, 1961. 1961 TV descriptions of Page said, "There's nothing to see. It's just a town on the mesa for the construction gang and their families. There's churches and schools, a shopping center, and a mess of trailers." We still have that. 4 million cubic yards of concrete. End of November 1962. The dam is 80% completed. Another Hollywood movie comes to town, the greatest story ever told. It's about the life of Christ. And the director said this country looked more like the Holy Land than the Holy Land. I like the slide on the left because it shows the road that came from Wahweap Creek to Cane Creek. And Art Green graded that road 24 miles in 1962 and was taking trips from the Cane Landing up to Rainbow Bridge. On the right, one of the sets for Nazareth. Another depiction, it's near the crossing of the Fathers. Tower Butte is in the left background. And this is an area where the river was wider and shallower. This was a scene for the baptism of Christ. People who came off the river, maybe had been on the river for 30 days, were rubbing their eyes, wondering if they were hallucinating when they saw these garments. It was cold. There were a lot of extras from the town of Page. People were volunteering. But it was very cold in November, and they were sometimes getting wet, and described those situations. Here's a helicopter in the middle of this scene from 1 AD. Here is the high water mark. You can see some logs and how deep the river flow would be even at this wide area of the canyon during the snowmelt. Sometimes the best way to get around, even in 1962, was still on horseback. And in 1962 marked the very first robbery that occurred in the town of Page. $400 in guns stolen from Babbitt's trading post. A view of the river flowing through the diversion tunnel, and the other 2 photos show the high melt, snow melt time of year in the summer, early summer. And the boats were sent down and high scalers were sent to just check how things were going with the river flowing through the diversion tunnel. That right diversion tunnel was sealed in January 1963, and the lake was 16 miles long to Warm Creek. And then the river would go through the left diversion tunnel, which was several feet higher than the right one. Of course, sealing off the river and forcing it through the dam caused cold, clear water and which degraded beaches and sandbars, loss of critical habitat for native fish, and regulating daily high and low flows of the dam, as opposed to the annual spring flooding. The warm, low summer flows. It was just a totally different regime, and non-native vegetation increased, and even native vegetation behaved abnormally, and a lot of damage to archaeological sites occurred. 500,000 visitors came by 1966. That far exceeded their forecast. And the Park Service in 1962 on the left is planning 500,000 visitors within the next few years to the Wawweep campground, which they're putting in. Finally, the last bucket of concrete. 1963, September, Lem Wiley threw his hat that he had worn throughout the whole project into the last bucket. And that is the only thing that's buried in the dam. Despite the strike that had come close to crippling the project, despite having to manage 2,000 men and keep abreast of more than 3,000 technical drawings, hundreds of contracts, change orders, tests, reports, and assorted headaches, despite the fact if this wasn't the best dam ever built, and if it wasn't built on time, he alone would be responsible, Wiley still considered the business of running the town and placating the politicians and keeping the parasitic conmen at bay to be the toughest part of the job. The park was dedicated in 1964. Daughter Jean said, in his memory, a new town where his hopes and dreams have come to rest. John Page worked for the Bureau from 1909 to 1947. He was the engineer on Boulder Dam for 5 years. He was commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation for 5 years. And he had to retire due to poor health, but he still worked as a consultant for another 5 years. On the left is Dora Knight. She and her husband ran the airport. She dressed in her black dress with, I'm sure, pearls and white gloves. She's presenting a young Navajo girl who's giving flowers to Princess Margaret and Lord Snowden. They took a trip with Art Green to Rainbow Bridge, and there's a good oral history about that. They stayed out at the Wawweep Lodge. Another famous visitor was Norman Rockwell. He was commissioned by the Bureau of Reclamation to paint this beautiful, huge painting of the dam and the Navajo family. It was at the Visitor Center, Carl Hayden Visitor Center, for many years, but it's now residing at the Stockbridge Museum, the Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. There are 2 replicas, one at the Powell Museum and one at the Carl Hayden Visitor Center. The power plant was completed, and power, as soon as a turbine was ready, the power began generating. The dam was dedicated in September of 1966. Stuart Udall is at the podium, and Lady Bird Johnson was here. The concrete lab in the center of page 1958 has an interesting history. It's became the John Wesley Powell Memorial Museum 100 years after John Wesley Powell made his first trip through the Grand Canyon. It got a facelift and a huge remodel, upgraded wiring and plumbing after some flooding, and it's now the Powell Museum and Archives. They are open from March through October. And this wonderful hand-carved map is at the Powell Museum. It depicts the landscape from the Vermilion Cliffs and the early parts of Grand Canyon up to Horseshoe Bend. Maybe you can see that, and the town of Page is circled. The star on the left is Wawweep Marina, and on the right is about the Keene Creek landing site. I tried to draw in what might have been the route. It went around Castle Rock and also Romana Mesa. The lake is much lower than is depicted in this map, so that Antelope Island is now no longer an island. You can't use the shortcut to get through from Wawweep to Warm Creek. You now have to go all the way around Antelope Point. The Visitor Center went in 1968. It's beautiful. It's got a full view of the dam, the upstream and downstream from the windows 700 feet above. the floor of the canyon, and its universal style. It was renamed for Carl Hayden Visitor Center. Carl Hayden was Arizona senator. He was the longest serving senator at the time. It's since been surpassed. And he had these plans. He really pushed for Arizona to get their share of the water. We mentioned Marble Canyon and Bridge Canyon Dam. That Kanab Tunnel is interesting, and note that there were 3 power plants planned. These dams were proposed in the 20s and they were authorized in 1950. But due to protests from the Ladies Garden Club and many other organizations, they were abandoned in 1968. Here's an early brochure from the Bureau trying to reassure people that we're not going to ruin Glen Canyon or Grand Canyon. Marble Canyon Dam is outside the Grand Canyon Park boundaries, and to reassure river runners, there's going to be at least 1,000 cubic feet per second outflow. Bridge Canyon Dam would be 83 feet deep at Havasu, but below the lowest waterfall, and only 13 miles along the border of Grand Canyon National Park. So at first, the Sierra Club endorsed it if it was built to low height and some other criteria. And it's important to remember that when Grand Canyon became a national park in 1919, that reclamation projects were still the purview of the Secretary of the Interior. David Brower really regretted that he had made a tragic mistake with Glen Canyon in not fighting it earlier and sooner and harder. The Sierra Club was really a small organization in 1950, only 7,000 members. But by the time he ran these ads in the New York Times and the Washington Post, there were 48,000 members. Floyd Dominy, the commissioner of the Bureau, said, "Oh, if we put these dams in, more people will be able to enjoy the Grand Canyon." But Brower asked, should we flood the Sistine Chapel so tourists can get nearer the ceiling? He really helped organize with the Wilderness Society and many other people fighting those 2 dams in the Grand Canyon. And part of the solution, let's go back. They called, when Navajo Generating Station came in, they called it the town America's most powerful town, because now we had the hydropower and now there's going to be this huge coal-fired generating plant. And that kind of took the place of a former monikers of the drinkingest, gamblingest, churchiest town in America. So Page has always had these booms and busts. And when the Navajo generating plant was being built, that's another boom, and another huge trailer park came to town. This coal-fired plant generating electricity would replace the power that Bridge Canyon and Marble Canyon dams would have provided, largely to power the Central Arizona project. Arizona had fought California in an 11-year lawsuit that was settled by the Supreme Court. They said that the Secretary of Interior can purchase 24% of the generating station's power for the Central Arizona project. And that is pumping water upstream from the lower Colorado River to Phoenix and Tucson. It was a $4.4 billion project, the largest single power user in Arizona, pumping 1.5 million acre feet. And it was celebrated as a bipartisan achievement, the most celebrated in the 20th century. I've wondered why they didn't cover it and for the evaporation loss, and I read that it would have cost 4 times more to cover it. That doesn't seem quite right, but you can see more about Carl Hayden at the visitor center named for him when it reopens, hopefully when the government shutdown is over. Russell Martin, in A Story That Stands Like a Dam, said, "It has begun to dawn on many Americans that our technologies could diminish lives as well as enrich them." Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring in 1962, and of course that coincided with all the protests going on about water development on Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. Wilderness Act, we talked about Canyonlands. some huge environmental disasters were happening, just promoting more environmental legislation. And an irony is that our environmental president, it looks like, was Richard Nixon. And just to remind people that this was when the Vietnam War was going on, and Americans, a lot of them were mistrusting the federal government. But October 27th, 1974, Gerald Ford signed the enabling legislation for the Bureau to turn over the equipment and facilities to Page, March 1st, 1975. It had taken 6 years of planning. Citizens had to vote to accept it. Coconino County had to pass a resolution, and Page became truly the youngest town in Arizona. The celebration was later that month, and it tied in with the bicentennial, which was happening the next year. Some say that if we had to choose one symbol to represent the early beginnings of Page, that it would be a hard hat, and this one is in the museum collection at the Powell Museum. If you want to know more about this story, I recommend A Story That Stands Like a Dam. And John McPhee's book, Encounters with the Archdruid, has a chapter or a section about David Brower and Floyd Dominy taking a river trip through Grand Canyon. It's an engaging read. We'll let Wallace Stegner have the last word. Though they have diminished it, they haven't utterly ruined it. Though these walls are lower and tamer than they used to be, and though the whole sensation is a little like looking at a picture of Miss America that doesn't show her legs, Lake Powell is beautiful. It isn't Glen Canyon, but it is something in itself. And now that the reservoir is approaching 25% of full pool, you can see about 75% of Glen Canyon. So I invite you to come see Page. You can look at the city website, visit pagearizona.com. If you've been here before, maybe you're inspired to come back for another visit and explore more. If you haven't been here, all I can say is why not? And because it might be cumbersome to ask questions or make comments, you're welcome to email me at staffordlucinda@gmail.com.